For more on tariffs in Hollywood, let's bring in Beverly Barrett. She is a lecturer at the University of Houston's Bauer College of Business. It's good to see you. Thanks for coming in. It's an interesting topic, I think.
Good to see you too, Sean. Hope you're well this evening.
Yeah, so I'm good. How big of a global business is Hollywood? Because we tend to think about, just the borders here in the U.S. And why do international markets matter so much to the U.S. film industry? We just heard that they were counting on more than $700 billion for $700 million for China alone.
Right. It is a very big industry. It's more than 100 billion annually, Hollywood. And, particularly since 2012 with the US China film agreement, the market share for China increased. And that year it went from 20 US made films to 34 US made films could be shown in China. And so just in the last, 13 years, the US market has benefited from more market access to China, given the US China film agreement of 2012.
Let's talk about the tariffs, and especially in these trade disputes, and how they could impact Hollywood directly or even indirectly. Like, how is Hollywood adapting to the international pressures?
Right. It's a really good question because, the trade in Hollywood film is really a service. It's not a good, but it's vulnerable to retaliation, and retaliation could be limiting market access. As I mentioned, the increased quota for U.S. films in China since 2012. Retaliation could limit that access, not only in China, but even in Europe. Europe has long presented a cultural exception, and France that they have cultural, content control over their films. And so it's definitely a piece in retaliation. And then as far as the goods that come in, the equipment that could be subject to tariffs in the United States, steel equipment and such like that.
Yeah, and what about streaming platforms such as Netflix, Disney Plus? How do they play in this conversation about tariffs, global markets, and such?
That's a good question, particularly today. We heard the Netflix earnings for the first quarter are up and doing relatively well, and the market prices, doubled in the last 2 years. So as of right now, they're somewhat unscathed from this trade war that's focused on goods, and this is a streaming service. And so the only something they could be vulnerable to is limited access if a government decides that they're not going to allow that streaming anymore, but they're not subject to the import tax.
Yeah. I'm sorry, we've all seen the numbers and gone through numbers and know tariffs and know the uncertainty of all this. But just speak about like personal experiences about these tensions and what you're hearing in the United States and countries such as China and the EU that have these disputes that are going on. For example, China is enjoying massive growth in its own film industry and kind of turning its back on big Hollywood releases.
Yes, you're right. So just in the last couple of days, the Hollywood Reporter has said that China is considering not only limiting local content, but the preferences of the Chinese people. They might prefer local content and limit the international content. And so as popular sentiment may change, there may be an increased preferences for domestic-made films rather than for Hollywood and made films in China.
Yeah, I just came back recently from being there for 1 month. And I can tell you that the national pride for the success of NJA 2 was simply huge. And they talked about their success and the fact that the graphics, the music, the talent, everything's kind of coming together there for them right now. So do you think, how's that going to play into all of this tariff tit for tat?
Right. It's really important because we're seeing, domestic preferences and abilities soar. At the same time, there's more uncertainty towards the U.S. The U.S. producers would like to have access to that market, but it's definitely a tool that the Chinese and other countries can use in retaliation, is limiting access to that market. And so it's yet to be seen. We'll see what negotiations bring, but definitely they may not be at such a loss if they don't have the U.S. made films because their own film industries are developing.
Yeah, what about visa restrictions, something like that? If that kicks in international artists, international directors, could that have a chilling effect on this cross-pollination, if you will?
Yes, that's always an option too, because all the crews, the teams that go and film abroad, they have to get visas to do that work. And so if for some reason they're not able to get the visas to work abroad, they're not able to do the film on location. And so it's always something we do here in the U.S. to give visas to foreign film crews. We in the U.S. expect foreign countries to give our crews visas as well to film abroad.
I'm curious, is the film industry viewed as an economic asset or a cultural export in these trade conversations? Because artists,
Right.
of course, want it to be art, and the bottom
Mhm.
line guys want it to be the bottom line, but should it be a weapon in this ongoing tariff?
Yes. It's a great question, because it's actually both, because it is a driver of the economy. It's a profitable business, $1 billion, $100 billion more industry for Hollywood. So it's definitely an economic driver, but it's also a cultural export, right? And so it's been a soft power element of the US since the rise of Hollywood after World War II, all around the world, first in Europe and now in China. And so it's definitely still a cultural export, and it's something that's sort of a barometer of sentiment, like where is the public? Do they want to intake the foreign films? Do they prefer the local films? It's definitely both. It's a really valuable cultural export, and very telling about culture and which cultures are being accepted.